Good afternoon. My name is Vasilios Marinis, and I'm delighted to welcome you to another lecture in the Yale Lecture Series. I will now turn the microphone to my colleague, Professor Felicity Hartley, who will introduce the speaker and the respondent.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker and the respondent today, two scholars who have made pivotal contributions to the field as vibrant teachers, generous scholars, and innovative scholars. Our speaker is François Pacha-Miran, an historian of the art and archaeology of the Byzantine and post-Byzantine world, currently based at the Institut des Langues Rares, one of the four institutes of the École Pratique des Hautes Études at the University of Paris. A graduate of the École du Louvre in art history and archaeology, he undertook an MA and PhD at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, pursuing research on Syriac manuscripts specifically. This work continued in a postdoctoral fellowship at the Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art, when working in partnership with the Bibliothèque Nationale de France and an international team of chemists. He analyzed 76 medieval manuscripts in Arabic, Coptic, Greek, and Syriac to better understand the pictorial techniques used in Byzantine and Islamic workshops. This year, he was awarded the prestigious Prix Marc de Montalembert, which will allow him to further his research on the art of the illuminated book in the Christian Levant between the 10th and the 13th centuries. Responding to François is Ephraim Ishak, a specialist in liturgical studies and manuscripts, who is currently principal investigator at the Austrian Academy of Sciences and visiting professor at Central European University in Vienna. Since finishing his PhD at the Holy Spirit University of Kaslik, Lebanon, Ephraim has worked closely on the history of Syriac and Afra according to their manuscripts, on East and West Syriac General Councils, and the history of ecumenism in the Middle East. He often takes a digital humanities approach in his research, which has been supported by a range of prestigious institutions and libraries from Italy to America. In addition to his scholarship, his teaching of liturgy and Syriac language at the University of Salzburg and the Central European University in Vienna has helped to shape the development of the field in important ways, with his focus on critical issues in current Syriac liturgical practice, as well as his sharing of an academic vision for possible liturgical reform. I now turn to begin our proceedings to François, whose lecture is entitled Shaping the Lectionary, Liturgical Readings and the Genesis of Syriac Manuscript Illumination, 11th to 13th centuries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hartley. And first, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to present my research on Syriac manuscripts. My thanks also go to the library's directors and staff who support me and grant me permission to take photographs, which we will have the pleasure of studying together today. This lecture is entitled Shaping the Lectionary. This title refers to an invention that was a major revolution in the history of liturgical practices in the Christian East. Until then, the Gospel book had been the preferred medium for liturgical readings. The beginning and end of readings were indicated in the margins or in the text, and these rubrics were collected in tables placed before the text. Yet collections of readings arranged according to the liturgical year are attested in Jerusalem as early as the 5th century, in the Armenian and Georgian traditions. But it's mainly from the 8th century onwards that this new type of choir book spread throughout the Christian East. This phenomenon seems to have been quite similar in the Byzantine Empire, the Caucasus, and Mesopotamia. In this region, the first signs of the transition from the four Gospels to the lectionary appear as early as the 8th and 9th centuries. However, the shaping of the reading system used by the Syriac churches followed a singular path, as it developed in parallel with two independent liturgical traditions. The East Syriac tradition, that of the so-called Nestorian Church of the East, and the West Syriac one, to which belonged the Syrian Orthodox Church. This lecture will focus on West Syriac lectionaries, which dominate the medieval production. Yet, some East Syriac manuscripts will sometimes help completing our vision, as these two traditions shared many common liturgical and artistic practices. From the early 11th to the early 14th centuries, 53 West Syriac lectionaries, dated, have been preserved in addition to numerous undated copies. Most of them were produced in monasteries in a region stretching from Melitene and Edessa to Nineveh, centers around the hills of Turabdin in southern Turkey. Among these manuscripts, only 26 illustrated copies are preserved, a number that includes many fragments. These few witnesses, however, constitute the main remnants of Syriac iconographic production during the Abbasid period. The purpose of this lecture, therefore, is to examine this somewhat unknown material through the double lens of liturgical practices, layout, and iconography. My goal today is to analyze the parallel between the rise of the lectionary itself as a new choir book and the genesis of the illustration that adorns the most luxurious copies. The very first step in our reflection is to analyze the way in which this new book has been named. Among the few Syriac illustrated manuscripts preserved from the Abbasid period, only 8 still contain their colophons. There are therefore very few sources available for studying the terms used by the scribes to describe these books. Most of them were referred to in rather general terms, with no mention of the reading system. The earliest trace of this phenomenon appears in the manuscript Damascus Syrian Orthodox Patriarchate 353, dated 1054. Its copies simply translated the Greek word tetraevangelon as the Syriac kathovo tetraevangelion, meaning book of the 4 Gospels, or more literally, 4 Gospel book. While such terms clearly indicate the textual content of the book, they provide no information about its structure. But, strictly speaking, Damascus 353 is not a lectionary, but rather a 4 Gospel book containing a continuous text. Similarly, the manuscript Mardin, Church of the 40 Martyrs 37, contains a note dated 1272 that refers to it simply as a Gospel, Evangelion, and a book, Kathovo. Yet this one is not a 4 Gospel book, but a collection of readings arranged according to the Syrian Orthodox liturgical calendar. Such lack of precision is attested in many other manuscripts. The lectionary More Gabriel 6, dated 1201, contains a note that describes it merely as a book. It seems also that the perception of lectionaries as sacred objects influenced the way they were designated. Thus, the colophon of the lectionary Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Syriac 355, makes no mention of the readings. The manuscript is simply called Evangelion Sorido Mogadisho, meaning holy and venerable gospel. Likewise, the lectionary Damascus 348, dated 1222, was described as a venerable gospel, Evangelion Sorido. Although the term book was most commonly used, it was sometimes combined with expressions referring to the 4 evangelists, 4 gospels, or the good news, yet without any mention of the liturgical readings. Similar terminology was also used in manuscripts other than lectionaries. At the end of BNF Syriac 30, around 1190, a note states that the writing of the book of the 4 Gospels is completed, Kosovo the Tetra Evangelium. BNF Syriac 41, made between 1188 and 1204, is described as the Holy Gospel, Evangelion Qaddisho. And on the last folio of BNF Syriac 54, dated 1192, one can also read that the writing of the holy and venerable Gospel of Christ, O God, is completed. Evangelion Sohido Damshiho Alloho. Therefore, it seems that Syriac versions of the Greek Evangelion were widely adopted by the scribes of illustrated lectionaries whose colophons are preserved. By contrast, the form for Gospel, Tetra Evangelion, remains rare during the Abbasid period. The only lectionary to use this term in the late 13th or early 14th century once belonged to the church of Morgi in Karakosh. On the first page, on the frontispiece, the scribe notes that he begins to write the four Gospel, Tetra Evangelium. Apart from the generic names, 7 illustrated lectionaries contain a colophon that clearly mentions their liturgical structure and function. Their chronological distribution proves that such an evolution of the vocabulary was neither sudden nor unified. As early as the 11th century, the lectionary London British Library Oriental 3372 is the oldest witness described as Kothobod Porashkarione de Evangelion Qaddisho, which means the book of the separated readings of the Holy Gospel. This formula enjoyed a certain afterlife in Syrian Orthodox manuscripts, mostly between the last third of the 12th century and the first quarter of the 13th. For instance, the scribe of the lectionary BNF Syriac 355 signed his work as the Gospel of the Separated Readings, Evangelion de Porashkarione. The lectionary Syriac 356 opened with the words, "With the hope and help of the Holy Trinity, we begin to write the separated readings of the Holy Gospel, Porashkarione de Evangelion Qaddisho." The same expression reappears at the end of the lectionary Vatican Syriac 559, written in 1260. The writing of the separated readings of the Holy Gospel is completed. The colophon of lectionary More Gabriel 5, dated 1226, confirms this conscious assimilation of the book to its liturgical structure. The manuscript is first described as the Holy Book of the life-giving good news of Christ God. Kosovo Qaddisho da Sovarfo Mahayonio Damshiho Alloho. However, the scribe also mentions the separated readings of the annual circle, Purash Kerione da Hrukyo Shatonoyo. Therefore, it seems that the collection of pericopes was perceived as the Gospel book itself, that is, the source of the divine teaching. As they indicate the separation of the readings, such terms implicitly suggest the liturgical function of the book. In a way, the readings themselves were perceived as the true title of the book. East Syriac manuscripts also attest to the perception of the book of readings within the Church of the East. The lectionary Berlin Staatsbibliothek Zachau 304 from the mid-11th century has lost its first page. However, a final note recalls the title that must have preceded the text, and which reads, "The readings for the whole year, the Hudra, the Hulashatta, are now complete for Sundays and Fridays, feast days, memorial, and supplications." A second East Syriac illustrated lectionary, dating back to the 12th or 13th century, is preserved at the Chaldean Patriarchate in Mosul. On the frontispiece, the scribe mentions the book of separated readings from the Holy Gospel for the whole year. كثابات براشقريان دوانجيلون قديشات خلاشاتا. The colophon of the same manuscript also contains the expression Venerable Gospel, Evangelion Seriva. Its use confirms that the terms Book of Readings and Gospel were probably interchangeable in the minds of the copyists. It seems therefore that two phenomena occurred simultaneously within the two main Syriac churches during the Abbasid period. On the one hand, the emergence of a collection of liturgical readings. On the other hand, the assimilation of the new type of book with the Gospel itself. The similar expression that tended to designate both of them attests to their gradual assimilation in the vocabulary. This semantic evolution accompanied the decline of the four Gospel book and its replacement by the Lectionary. Yet, a collection of readings for the whole year cannot be improvised. To be useful and practical, this choir book must be tailored to the reality of liturgical practices, and more specifically to the calendar. Studying the distribution of readings is therefore essential to understanding the structure of Syriac lectionaries and how their illustration were conceived. Unlike the East Syriac tradition, the West Syriac one never underwent any standardization and retained a remarkable diversity throughout the Abbasid period. One notable difference is that the West Syriac lectionaries provide readings not only for the Eucharist, called Korobo or Korbono, but also for Matins, Safro, and Vespers, Ramsho or Noga. The varied order of the readings attests to the coexistence of several systems, echoing the many local traditions that prevailed in the Syrian Orthodox Church. The most significant variation concerns the long series of Sundays between Pentecost and the beginning of Advent. In some West Syriac lectionaries, this period of 12 weeks seems to have been structured around 3 summer feasts, which determine the names and readings for Sundays. That are the Transfiguration on August the 6th, the Dormition on August the 15th, and the Exaltation of the Cross on September the 14th. Illustrated lectionaries, on the other hand, mostly follow a different system. The 3 feasts do not structure the period from Pentecost to Advent, but are instead integrated to the cycle of Sundays. As you can see here, the oldest witness, Damascus 353, provides readings for 5 Sundays after Pentecost. The Friday of Apostles follows immediately and marks the beginning of the period of the Apostles, which lasts 10 Sundays. This period is interrupted by the Transfiguration and ends with the Exaltation of the Cross. Nearly a century later, the lectionary Mardin 37 attests to the evolution of this system. 9 Sundays take place between Pentecost and the Transfiguration, followed by 4 other Sundays that culminate with the Dormition of the Virgin and the Exaltation of the Cross. The manuscript Damascus 348 introduces a system that was more widely adopted in 13th century lectionaries. The period after Pentecost is reduced to 6 Sundays, while the period of the Apostles is reduced to 3 Sundays. Then comes the Transfiguration, which opens a period of 7 Sundays, ending with the Exaltation of the Cross. A similar distribution is found in British Library Edition 7169, where the 6 Sundays after Pentecost are followed by the 3 Sundays of the Apostles. After the Transfigurations, there come 7 Sundays. A feast of the Mother of God is inserted between the second and the third, and the last one is followed by the Feast of the Cross. The lectionary Syriac 66 from the John Rylands Library in Manchester offers a reading system that varies slightly from the previous one. 6 Sundays after Pentecost, 3 Sundays of the Apostles, 7 Sundays after Transfigurations, then the Dormition and the Feast of the Cross. We find precisely the same structure in the BNF Syriac 355. However, the cross opens a period of 8 Sundays that ends with a second feast of the Mother of God. The lectionaries Mardin 38 and Mardin 41 show similar systems which also deviate from this distribution. The 9 Sundays after Pentecost are completed by the Transfiguration, which gives its name to the following 2 Sundays. A period of 4 to 5 Sundays separates the Dormition from the cross. And finally, the lectionaries British Library Additional 7170 and Vaticanus Syriac 559 also follow a common pattern, which differs somewhat from the previous variants. The period of 6 Sundays after Pentecost is still present. It's followed by the period of the Apostles, which extends over 7 weeks, interrupted by the Transfiguration and the Dormition. Thereafter come the 4 Sundays of the period of Hananio, which precede the exaltation of the cross. Let's have now a closer look to the readings. The study of the texts reveals another distinctive feature of Syrian Orthodox lectionaries: the wide range of biblical references and their varied combinations. In most lectionaries, the readings related to the Sundays and the feast days are generally the same from one manuscript to the other. However, a comparison of some witnesses reveals the existence of coherent groups of manuscripts, whose content was likely related to local traditions and perhaps even to specific workshops. The testimony of 4 lectionaries produced between the late 12th and the mid-13th century highlights a real consistency in the choice of feast readings, despite slight variations from one book to another. The main differences between these manuscripts consist of a different arrangement of the same corpus of texts. The criteria used to select and organize this text might have been consistent, although they were used in different ways. For example, during the Christmas period, the selection of readings follows a chronological and thematic pattern, as evidenced by the content of the readings for each Sunday, from the dedication of the church to the synaxis of the Mother of God. For a feast of the synaxis on December the 26th, the selection of pericopes is based on the same criteria, excerpt from the synoptic Gospels mentioning the Virgin's womb. But, as you can see here, they were organized in a slightly different order. For the Sunday after Christmas, we can make a similar comparison and notice that the lectionaries Mardin 33 and More Gabriel 5 propose to read the events recounted in the first 2 chapters of Luke. But the lectionaries Mardin 37 and Mardin 41, on the other hand, adopt a chronological approach. They both draw a parallel between the adoration of the shepherds and that of the Magi. However, this quite uniform structure is not common to all illustrated lectionaries. The manuscript More Gabriel 6, produced in the same region and at the same time, shows marked differences in the choice of texts. It seems less committed to the continuous reading of the same gospel, particularly for the series of Sundays after Epiphany. A brief overview of the reading confirms that each of the lectionaries, except for certain major feasts, shows a preference for one of the synoptic Gospels. This preference is revealed through the choice of heading of readings, but also, as we shall see now, in the selection of verses. Another element that reflects this original aspect of Syriac reading systems is the selection and order of the verses that constitute the harmonized pericopes read during the Passion Week. The clearest example of this phenomenon are the reading of the Last Supper on the evening of Maundy Thursday and those of the Passion, divided between the first eve of the night and the ninth hour of Good Friday. In all the lectionaries, the narrative progression of this episode is almost identical. The most comprehensive version sets out the readings like this. At the first Vespers of Good Friday, the narrative of the Last Supper. When the evening liturgy was celebrated on Maundy Thursday, the discourse of Jesus after the Last Supper. At the first eve of Friday night, the agony at Gethsemane. At the second eve, the arrest. At the third eve, the appearance before the Sanhedrin and Peter's denials. At Matins, the trial before Pilate. At the third hour, the second harmonized narrative of the trial involving Pilate and Herod, followed by the death sentence. At the middle of the day, the crucifixion. At the ninth hour, Jesus' death, sometimes followed by a composite pericope for the veneration of the cross. These pericopes, as you can see here, were assembled for a multitude of short excerpts aiming to offer the most detailed version of each episode of the Passion. However, they differ significantly to such an extent that there are only 2 illustrated lectionaries that contain exactly the same text. There is a great diversity both in the choice of the main gospel, the one announced by the heading, which provided the narrative framework, and often also the connecting phrases, and the selection and ordering of the episodes that form each sequence, borrowed from the other gospels. Therefore, it's not uncommon to find pericopes assembled from 3 or 4 gospels, occasionally totaling dozens of references brought together in a single reading. A quick comparison of 4 versions of the midday reading on the Good Friday gives an idea of the scale of such pericopes and the subtle variations in their composition. Marginal notes attest to the importance of this exhaustive reconstruction of the Passion narrative. A great care must have been taken in copying these readings in each workshop. Alongside the verses of the text, the names of the evangelists from whom each section was borrowed were indicated. Such indications are sometimes imprecise, even erroneous, particularly when it comes to identifying the origin of expressions intended to situate the action or introduce dialogues, which could either come from any one of the Gospels. Now, let's move to the images. It's likely that the genesis of Syriac illumination might have been linked to the rise of the lectionary and the elaboration of the reading systems. Indeed, the 2 peaks of activity in manuscript workshops, the mid-11th century and the first half of the 13th, reflect the development of 2 distinctly different layouts. The oldest manuscripts mostly contain miniatures which do not necessarily present thematic or chronological continuity. But subsequently, we see increasingly developed cycles that accurately retrace the biblical episodes linked to the liturgical calendar. However, the formation of a comprehensive cycle of feasts did not happen suddenly. During the Abbasid period, this evolution is obvious, but a comparison of the preserved manuscripts shows the irregular nature of this process. We may therefore wonder to what extent the development of a complete iconographic cycle for Sundays and feast days was linked to the elaboration of an increasingly complex liturgical calendar. In any case, it seems to have followed a slow and discontinuous evolution. What is certain is that the conception of the feast cycle accompanied the gradual structuring of the lectionary and the decline of the four Gospels. In the first half of the 11th century, lectionaries were mainly illustrated with full-page miniatures. Of the three examples of this period, two show a similar layout, reflecting a consistent approach to the illustration of the Gospels. The manuscript Damascus 353 is a first milestone. Each of its full-page miniatures depicts full-length figures identified by inscriptions in Greek and Syriac. Christ's blessing, surrounded by Saint Peter and Paul, the Mother of God, holding a scroll inscribed with the first word of the Canticle of the Visitation, and a prayer of intercession in Greek. John the Baptist announcing the advent of the Lamb of God, Saint Balsamo in prayer, surrounded by a snake and a dog, and Saint George wearing armor. It seems here that the patron wished to highlight, on the one hand, the prominent protagonists of the gospel narrative, and on the other hand, two saints who were close to his heart. During the 12th century, the development of this type of layout led to more restricted decorative programs centered on the evangelists. On this point, it's worth noting the diversity of layout options and the variety of relationships between text and images. When the book contained the four Gospels or the New Testament, the images were sometimes gathered at the beginning or end of the book, framing the text in a symbolic way. Even in four Gospel books, the depiction of the evangelist could be used to divide sections of the text and give rhythm to the reading. This is attested, for example, by the three manuscripts you can see on the screen now. The Lectionary British Library Oriental 3372 displays three full-page miniatures in two superimposed registers. The Nativity appears upon the baptism. The entry into Jerusalem is depicted above the evangelists. The miniature of these three feasts offer here a first attempt at summarizing the gospel narrative. They bring together the crucial episodes of Jesus' childhood and the beginning of his public ministry, while introducing the Passion with an image associated with Palm Sunday. Here, however, the miniatures are still grouped together at the beginning of the volume. Such was still the use in a later witness, likely made in the early 14th century, once preserved in the church of Morgiworgis in Karakosh. Such is not the case, however, with the lectionary Zachau 304, also dated from the early 11th century. This manuscript, as preceding said, belongs to the East Syriac tradition, but it has been proved by Sebastian Brock that it was likely created in a famous West Syriac workshop for a patron who belonged to the Church of the East. Here the miniatures have been inserted throughout the text, facing the readings to which they relate. Thus we find the baptism of Christ, the Virgin and Child, the entry into Jerusalem, the washing of the feet, the Last Supper, the mere bearing at the woman at the sepulchre, the Anastasis, Pentecost, the finding of the true cross, and the vision of Constantine. There is a clear distinction between images associated with Jesus' childhood and early ministry, and a larger cycle devoted to the Passion, which extend to Pentecost, and finally a series of two register miniatures recounting the story of the cross. 5 miniatures are full-page compositions, 2 are medium-sized, and 3 are small. As such, This lectionary presents all the elements that will later characterize the major cycles of the Abbasid period. A selection of images relating to the major events of the liturgical year scattered throughout the text, highlighting the structure of the book, whose dimension could vary depending on the importance the patron wished to give to each feast. The experiments evidenced by this lectionary thus laid the foundations for the illustrations methods applied to the luxurious copies produced over the following two centuries. In the late 12th century, a new type of layout developed, cycles of images relating to the main feasts of the year, collected in one or more sections, forming a preface to the text. In this case, the miniatures were usually inserted after the tables of readings, sometimes preceded or followed by a cross. This layout was adopted in three manuscripts dated more or less precisely between the end of the 12th and the middle of the 13th century. First of them, the lectionary Mardin 37 opens with 5 pages preceded by a cross. All the miniatures are displayed in the same way. Full page, they stand out against a blue background limited by ornamental frames. The first 3 depict the Annunciation, Nativity, and the Presentation in the Temple. The next 3 depict the Ascension, Pentecost, and the Virgin interceding with the donor, and the last 2 depict the Evangelists. This lectionary thus offers a summary of the main events of the Lord's earthly life, emphasizing episodes from his childhood at the expense of the Passion, which is avoided in favor of the Ascension and Pentecost. Although there are a few gaps at the end of the text, the excellent state of preservation of this manuscript rules out the loss of any pages, including illustrated ones. We must therefore assume that its patron wished to emphasize those passages of the gospel narrative that manifested the divine theophany in its most important aspects, blurring the memory of the crucifixion. A lectionary from the early 13th century is hidden beneath 2 volumes in the BNF, Syriac 355 and Syriac 356. Originally, it also took the form of a collection of readings preceded by a choir of full pages miniatures. Most of these paintings are now preserved in Syriac 355. They were originally immediately followed by the text, which now starts in Syriac 356. The order note preserved in Syriac 355 also provides a list of the 24 images that formed a particularly elaborated cycle. The Annunciation and Nativity, which are now lost, were followed by the Presentation in the Temple, the Baptism, and the Transfiguration and Resurrection of Lazarus, which are also lost. The Passion cycle opened with the entry into Jerusalem, followed by the washing of the feet, and 3 lost images, the Last Supper, the Crucifixion, and the Burial. The miniature of the Resurrection, also lost, was followed by the incredulity of Thomas and the Ascension. Pentecost and Dormition have also disappeared. The exaltation of the cross and the daisies finally preceded the Evangelists preserved in Syriac 356. No essential episode was therefore omitted from the major feasts of the year, offering a complete vision of the economy of salvation. But the painter of the Lectionary British Library edition 7169 went even further. He composed an almost exhaustive panorama of the main episodes of the life of Christ, adding several miraculous stories to the images of the major feasts. The illustrated sections were inserted between the index of readings and the main text, indicating that they were an integral part of the manuscript from the origin. The 14 miniatures grouped between folio 8 and 13 were preceded by a cross and followed by a medallion bearing the bust of Christ, Virgin, and the Apostles. The cycle includes 23 scenes divided into 13 compositions. The Nativity, associated with the adoration of the Magi and shepherds, facing the dream of Joseph and the baptism. The verso of folio 9 brings together the presentation in the temple, the beheading of John the Baptist, the healing of the paralytic at Capernaum, and the healing of a leper. Folio 10 displays the resurrection of Lazarus, the healing of the blind man at Jericho, and the Canaanite woman. And the verso shows Jesus driving the merchants from the temple and the washing of the feet. The Last Supper fills an entire page, which reverse shows the betrayal of Judas and the crucifixion. The anastasis in the lower register of folio 12 rector responds to a scene borrowed from an homily from an aside. And the 5 last miniatures are painted in full page and depict the mere bearers at the sepulchre, the incredulity of Thomas, the Ascension, Pentecost, and the finding of the cross. Alongside the establishment of the liturgical calendar, the division of the Gospel into pericopes led to the rise of a new type of illustrated lectionaries, which read its peak between the years 1220 and 1216. These manuscripts stand out as they integrate the miniatures directly into the text. So the structure of the text dictated the layout of the painting, which were now scattered throughout the book, following the rhythm of the readings. The most luxurious witnesses even provided images for each Sunday. The Lectionary Additional 7169 is the closest ancestor of these manuscripts. It marks the final stage to work an exhaustive iconographic program. 7 manuscripts adopted this intricate layout. Among these examples, 2 main categories can be distinguished. Lectionaries whose paintings focus on certain feasts, mainly from the Easter period, and lectionaries whose miniatures cover all the festive and Sunday readings. The first lectionaries of the 13th century feature a series of large miniatures inserted throughout the text at the location of the main feasts. The manuscript Mo Gabriel 6, dated 1201, thus has a remarkable and unparalleled layout. The miniatures are distributed throughout the text, but in a different order from that of the Gospel narrative. They concern only the mere burials at the tomb, depicted 3 times, followed by the anastasis and the crucifixion, also depicted twice. However, the very crude style of these images suggests that they were added to the volume long after its completion. It seems, nevertheless, that the patron wished to magnify the climax of the Easter readings, that is, the discovery of the empty tomb, by having the same scene reproduced several times across entire pages. In contrast, the lectionary Damascus 348 anticipates the exhaustive cycles that developed a few decades later. Its 7 miniatures mainly concern the celebration of the Passion and Easter. The cycle opens with the Last Supper, followed by the crucifixion and the woman at the tomb. The anastasis, Ascension, and Pentecost close the Easter period, while the Transfiguration marks the summer period. In this way, the illustration emphasizes the humanity of Jesus through its participation in the Paschal meal, his death and burial, and also highlights the divinity of the Son of God, shown by his victory over hell, his ascension, the descent of the Holy Spirit, and finally the vision of his glory on Mount Tabor. We must also include among this type of decoration the 5 surviving miniatures from the lectionary of the former Kevorkian collection, part of which now belong to the Assad collection. an imposing manuscript now reduced to burnt fragments, still depicting the Last Supper, crucifixion, the woman at the tomb, and the incredulity of Thomas and the evangelists. To imagine what such a manuscript might have looked like, we need to turn to the Lectionary Mardin 41, which features full-page paintings highlighting the most solemn celebration, divided into sections of unequal length. You can see here the baptism of Christ, the presentation in the temple, the crucifixion, and the burial, for instance. The Lectionary Damascus 356 should have adopted a similar structure, albeit less ambitious, but the painting of its miniature was abandoned as it was probably too costly, but the spaces left empty allow us to imagine the scenes that were to follow the rubrics. However, these manuscripts only illustrated the major feasts, but the increase in liturgical reading sometimes gave rise to even more extensive cycles. The last three lectionaries that I will mention to conclude are the best examples of an exhaustive illustration of the gospel narrative. Their miniatures were distributed throughout the text without limiting to a selection of feasts. Paintings were thus inserted for each major celebration, but also at the beginning of the Sunday readings, covering the entire life of Christ according to the structure of the Syrian Orthodox calendar. With no fewer than 32 miniatures, the Lectionary More Gabriel 5 is an ambitious attempt to illustrate the entire liturgical year. As you can see here with the Annunciation, the baptism of Christ, the descent of the cross, and Pentecost. Interestingly, another lectionary made in the same workshop 2 years later adapted the same layout in a less ambitious scale. As patrons might have been less wealthy, he decided to reproduce only 5 of these 32 miniatures. Other witnesses of a similar layout only subsist as fragments. A brilliant example is the leaf that was rediscovered 2 years ago by Ephraim Isaac at Yale Biblical Library, which preserves a miniature that shares many stylistic features with BNF Syriac 355 and 356, but which took originally place within the text as shown by the reading for the Sunday of Easter on the versa. As a sort of visual conclusion to our journey, let's turn to the most famous lectionaries of the 13th century, British Library Additional 7170 and Syriac 559 from the Vatican Library. These manuscripts, the second being a later copy of the first, are the most remarkable witnesses to an exhaustive illustration. The first has 48 medium-sized miniatures scattered throughout the body of text, and the second features exactly the same images plus 6 miniatures that are absent from the manuscript of the British Library, making a total of 54 illustrations. This means almost 1 miniature for each week of the year. I will not give the list, but instead let the images speak for themselves. Here, the entry into Jerusalem, in the first and the second one, the trial before Sanhedrin and the denial of Peter, the crucifixion, and the holy women at the tomb. As a conclusion, the emergence of highly developed pictorial cycles adapted to increasingly elaborate reading systems might have resulted from several factors. First, it should be noted that the very form of the lectionary, that is, a succession of sometimes composite pericopes relating to the feasts and Sundays of the year, seems to have influenced the genesis of certain images. The influence of text is evident in certain cases, particularly for the harmonized pericopes read during major feasts, for instance, the Nativity or the entry into Jerusalem, which feature elements borrowed from several Gospels. Even the design of certain manuscripts with little decoration may have been guided by the narrative purpose of the pericopes and the desire to summarize the year in a few striking images. Finally, the structure of the lectionary as a collection of readings might have influenced the arrangement of the miniatures within the books. Thus, the existence of lectionaries containing up to 300 readings and up to 50 miniatures does not seem coincidental. Both the book and its decorations contributed to this liturgical recomposition of the earthly life of the Lord following the calendar of the Church. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. Pasha Miran, thank you so much for this truly fascinating and meticulously researched paper, your analysis of the West Syriac illuminated lectionary manuscripts from the 11th to the 13th centuries offer a crucial window into how liturgical, semantic, and artistic practices evolved in parallel during the Abbasid period. Your work masterfully links three usually separate disciplines: the manuscript studies, the liturgical history, and art history. If you would allow me to briefly summarize your central findings, your lecture persuasively argues that the rise of the luxury lectionary was a simultaneous three-part evolution. First, there was a semantic shift where the new choir book, structured as a collection of readings, was gradually and consciously assimilated in vocabulary to the gospel itself, using terms like holy and vulnerable gospel. Second, the paper excellently documents a liturgical complexity within the West Syriac tradition, which retained a remarkable diversity of reading systems, necessitating the use of highly detailed, harmonized pericopes assembled from multiple Gospels during the most sacred times, such as the Passion Week. Third, and perhaps most compelling, you demonstrate a genesis of illumination, where the layout shifts from simple, isolated images to the development of exhaustive iconographic cycles integrated directly within the text, striving to provide an image of nearly every major celebration or Sunday reading. This leads me to a few lines of inquiry that I hope I can further deepen our discussion. My first line of inquiry concerns the lack of standardization within the West Syriac tradition. You aptly note the remarkable diversity in reading systems, a phenomenon common to other West Syriac liturgical elements like the Syriac anaphoras and, in general, the liturgical manuscripts. This invites a broader question. Do you attribute this liturgical diversity to a specific institutional factor, such as a weak, centralized patriarchate, which was perhaps less able to enforce liturgical conformity compared to the centralized authority seen, for example, in the Greek Byzantine tradition? This institutional context becomes particularly interesting when contrasted with your finding on the visual cycles. Although the texts themselves and the textual readings remain diverse, the pictorial program increasingly strives for an exhaustive, standardized presentation of the full economia, or the economy and the salvation life of Christ. This leads to my original question. Does the comprehensive visual cycle, in effect, function as a visual standardization that transcends the local variations still present in the text pericope, arrangement, and selection? In other words, was the image cycle a more ecumenical and universal means of dogmatic presentation than the textual calendar it was bound to? My second point focuses on the context and audience of these luxurious lectionaries in the Syriac tradition, which you refer to you, according to your note, as the new choir book. Could you please elaborate on the intended meaning of this term in the Syriac context? Should we understand what you call the choir book to mean a book specifically read by choir or gudo, or simply a book that stands at the reading table situated between two choirs, which is the typical Syriac arrangement in the Syriac sanctuary? This distinction is crucial, I think, for understanding the book's audience. Who was the intended audience for these miniatures and iconographical heavy system? Was the primary intent for the iconographic representations to be seen by the gathered community, for example, of the church, or were they intended primarily for the use of the bishops and the priests, who were the only ones physically handling and reading from these manuscript lectionaries? My third point is a scholarly inquiry concerning your corpus of manuscripts. First, on the reading system variants, you cite the manuscript from the Syrian Orthodox Patriarchate collection 348, dated from 1222, noting its system. My own reading suggests that this manuscript does include a reading for the Dormition Feast. It is simply scheduled after the 8 Sundays following the Feast of the Holy Cross. Would adjusting the interpretation of the calendar in this manuscript alert your conclusions regarding the system dominant in the 13th century? Second, on the earlier corpus, you begin your analysis of dated West Syriac lectionaries with Damascus, the manuscript of Damascus 353, dated to 1054 in the paper, but often dated according to the colophon, according to the month, should be 1055. I wanted to ask you if you would consider including earlier manuscripts that share its reading system, such as the manuscript from the Syrian Orthodox collection 354, which was formerly Damascus 12:9, which is again a Herculean Gospel lectionary for liturgical use, dated to 994, which precedes the 11th century peak of lectionary production, but almost the beginning of the 11th century. Including such earlier text perhaps might further clarify the transition phase you are describing. Finally, I want to return to the crucial theme of confessional borders and artistic interaction. You mentioned the remarkable case of the manuscript Berlin-Sachau 304, which was made, as you mentioned, and approved by Brock in a West Syriac workshop for an East Syriac pattern, a powerful example of what can be called as ecumenical collaboration. My question is twofold. First, can you provide further examples of such ecumenical manuscript collaboration that might have crossed confessional borders, such as evidence of Armenian or Byzantine miniature workshops producing works specifically for the West and East Syriac churches during this period? Second, given the geographical reach of the Syriac churches, can you detect a specific Coptic artistic influence, since they are sharing a Miaphysite dogma, that filtered into the illumination of these Syriac lectionaries, especially in the earliest cycles, which might provide another course for artistic development apart from the Byzantine tradition? I am particularly interested in how these cross-confessional and inter-regional influences contributed to the genesis of the illumination that you have been describing excellently. I would like to hear your questions in our discussions afterward. Thank you again, Dr. Basha Miran, for this outstanding contribution to our understanding of the Syriac book. I eagerly look forward to your thoughts on these matters and the general discussions that follows. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these brilliant questions. I will try to answer and to share my thoughts, because it's a kind of a work in progress, as you have understood. The other problem is that I studied only illustrated witnesses, trying to use also as comparisons non-illustrated manuscripts, but not the whole corpus. Concerning the standardization of the West Syriac tradition and this interesting diversity of reading system that can be compared with the huge diversity of Eucharistic prayers in the Syrian Orthodox Church, I think that it could be an interesting hypothesis to attribute this diversity to the ecclesiastical context. That is, no central power, no central authority from 518, from the exile of Severus of Antioch. And so that is a kind of nomadic power from a monastery to another that could explain this lack of centralization. That could also explain the lacks we observe in the production itself, because as the patriarchs and bishops resided in the most important monasteries during the Abbasid period, they were accompanied by monks and bishops, and perhaps also artists who work for them in copying manuscripts. And sometimes we can draw parallels between the effective presence of the patriarch in a region or a monastery and the production of manuscripts, even illustrated or not. So you said that there is a sort of similarity between this diversity of reading systems and diversity of illumination layout. Maybe the best way to understand this specificity of the West Syriac tradition would be to compare with the East Syriac one, which was uniformized from the 8th century, I think, under Catholicos Ishoiab III. The problem is that we only preserve 2 illustrated East Syriac lectionaries, so it's not possible to examine whether this uniformization, standardization of the reading system in the East Syriac tradition was related to the development of iconographical cycles. So the question is that there are many different ways to summarize and make a kind of synthesis of the gospel narrative. And the miniatures themselves, they operate similarly to the text. I noticed no particular variation, how to say this, there is no particular feature that could suggest similar situation between the pericopes and the miniatures. You were talking about a more universal way of synthesizing, summarizing the gospel narrative. I would say that as the Syriac communities from the 11th century onwards borrowed from the Byzantine tradition most of the iconographical patterns, they followed the same path when trying to integrate the most important events of the life of Christ to the liturgical books. And so they finally, as they shared also the main feasts of the liturgical year, they finally created a cycle that is quite similar to the one we can find in Greek manuscripts, or even in other traditions we can analyze later. So as I tried to understand what kind of specificity we could observe in the Syriac tradition, I found nothing but a very interesting fidelity to the Byzantine tradition, which is maybe linked to the desire of affirmating the Nicene Creed and this relation to the faith of the first councils. So a great diversity of reading system, great diversity of layout of the miniatures, but no particular relationship between the text itself, the content of the pericopes, and the way the miniatures were ordered. Concerning the context and audience of the lectionary, I used the term choir book, which was not maybe the best one, meaning the book for a sanctuary. But actually, the problem is to what audience was aware such luxurious witnesses intended for. As the manuscript I studied show very few traces of use, apart from the damages of time, water, fire, and so on. I guess that there's very costly manuscripts were intended to be offered, to be donated as treasures or presents. And there are many different historical sources talking about manuscripts that were written by patriarchs or bishops to be offered to a monastery, or precious manuscripts which were stolen from a monastery or destroyed during invasions, for example. And this concerns both the book itself, that is the parchment, the leaves, the miniatures, but also the cover when it was a precious one. So these luxurious lectionaries were probably not intended to be put on the pulpit or on the altar and to be read during the liturgy. Maybe some of them during some major feasts, why not? But most of the time they were kept in a sacristy or in the treasure of the church, as they were part of the treasure and also sign of the wealth, I say the wealth of a monastery, because of the cost of the parchment itself, the colors, the gold, and so on, and the time it needed to copy the text. So, to summarize, images before the text, to make the book kind of work of art, piece of art, but not only a reading book. Your question concerning the corpus is also really, really interesting. And as said, it's a very complex matter to draw conclusions from partial corpus and also from some manuscripts that lack colophons, dates, places of origin, or even leaves. So, for example, you're totally right concerning the manuscript Damascus 348, which includes actually reading for the Dormition. It's only the place that changes. Considering the earlier corpus, there is one illustrated lectionary that predates the 11th century. It's kept in the British Library. It's edition 139, but it's dated 999, but maybe 1000. And it contains only one miniature. This one is really interesting to understand the transition phase, which roughly corresponds to the 11th century, because it only contains one miniature, which was not placed at the beginning or at the end or within the text, but in the margin, and it depicts the Annunciation facing the reading for this feast. But it only shows that there were maybe some patrons were wishing to see images in the lectionaries. And this one decided to, he chose one feast of the year. Why was it the Annunciation? I have no idea. But he wanted this feast to be depicted in the book. It's kind of an archetype of later illustrated lectionaries. So it would be really interesting to make a larger comparison between the earliest witnesses of the corpus and non-illustrated lectionaries dated from the 9th and 10th century. And to be more exact, the first one I mentioned, Damascus 353, is not a lectionary, strictly speaking. It's a poor gospel book, but it contains headings for the pericopes and also reading tables. And it has been considered for years as a kind of early lectionary. That's the reason why I mentioned it. And it's also really interesting because it's one of the earliest witnesses of illustration in Syriac dated manuscripts. And concerning your last question about confessional borders, the example of Zachau 304 is really interesting. So there is no doubt about it's the community it was intended for, because it follows the East Syriac liturgical calendar, and it contains a particular version of the Syriac Gospels, which is the Peshitta, and also shows the vowel marks from the East Syriac tradition. But the colophon suggests that it was likely created in the monastery of Mor Gabriel in Qatmin, Tur ad-Din, and the names of the copyist, the painter, and the man who likely made the drawings and helped with the binding are attested in the West Syriac tradition. They were most probably the nephews of the bishop of Tur ad-Din, Yohannan, who is known for having restored the use of the Estrangela writing that you can see on this on the screen now, for example, at the end of the beginning of the 10th century. So the problem is that it's difficult to understand why an East Syriac patron decided to ask a West Syriac workshop to paint this lectionary. Actually, it's the only example I have for the whole Abbasid period. And I would say it's the only example we have for the whole Syriac manuscript production, considering only illustrated manuscripts. So it's as interesting as where. I only know about one example which is a very early one and could be compared with the Zlachau 304. It's the Syriac Bible of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Syriac 341, which was likely, it's difficult to say whether it was made in a West Syriac or East Syriac workshop, given that in the mid-6th century, the two traditions were not really separated. But it's quite probable that it was made for a West Syriac community, but it was reused probably from the 9th century onward in an East Syriac community. We have some clues of this change in the life of the manuscript, because an East Syriac hand added the names of the prophets and some inscriptions in the book and also corrections. So we're not absolutely entirely sure that it was a West Syriac manuscript at the beginning, but what is sure is that it was used in East Syriac community later, and this change was not a problem for the new owners of the manuscript, who received the iconographical cycle without any difficulty. So same images were shared by the two rival churches. Maybe another one, which is a later one, a manuscript also kept in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, it's Syriac 344, which was likely made between the 14th and 16th century. It's an East Syriac lectionary, but it was painted, and the paintings show Armenian and Syriac inscriptions. But the Armenian church belongs to the so-called Miaphysite tradition, not the East Syriac church. So it could be another example that I wish to study further of this this way the iconographical traditions went through the confessional borders. And to conclude, if I could detect a specific influence of external traditions in the iconography of Syriac manuscripts, it's quite difficult matter, because we find the same iconographical patterns in West Syriac, East Syriac, Coptic, and Greek manuscripts during the same period. The only difference concerns the style of the paintings. But we can sometimes observe some details, visual details that were borrowed likely not only from the Byzantine tradition, but mostly from the Arabic, the Islamic tradition. This is very common, and it's a good thing that we ended with these two miniatures, because we have an interesting depiction of the garden with the tomb of Jesus, depicted as an kind of Abbasid palace with the dome and the columns, and at the same time a reminiscence of the bestiaries and treatises of about plants and animals that were really common in this period in the Arabic world. So I would not say that there are specific influence from the Coptic or Armenian or Byzantine tradition, but sort of a common visual language that sometimes borrowed elements or motifs from non-Christian traditions.
Well, fascinating. And since we still have kind of a couple minutes, if I may, I can ask also one final question is concerning the harmonized readings that are a distinctive feature of the Syrian Orthodox lectionary, especially during the Passion Week, as you have demonstrated in your lecture. You know that these readings were meticulously assembled from a multitude of short excerpts from different Gospels, aiming to offer the most exhaustive version of each episode. Scribes even indicated the names of the evangelists from whom each section was borrowed in the margins. Even sometimes they were not really accurate, so you have the attributions in a way or another in not really accurate way. My question here, does this specific liturgical practice, the creation and the use of harmonized readings, suggest a particular theological emphasis, perhaps a greater concern for historical and factual completeness over the distinct witness of a single evangelist? In contrast to traditions that might prioritize the theological lens of, say, the Gospel of John, the Syriac tradition seems to employ a kind of super gospel for the most sacred moments of the year, or let's call it the proto-evangelion that could be circulated among the Aramaic Christians. You have excellently connected the Narsai hymns and the Mimre with a kind of this iconographic system. So I'm just wondering, do you find evidence in the surviving visual cycles, particularly in how those passion scenes are rendered, that this drive for exhaustive textual reconstruction explicitly influenced the visual details of the corresponding miniatures? For example, is there an iconographic detail that only makes sense when read in conjunction with an obscure verse integrated into the reading from a second or third gospel, thus proving that the painter was working directly from the harmonized text, not really from the general iconographic model? And would that lead us to kind of an original theology that was circulated among those Syriac-speaking Christians? Thank you so much again.
This is a really interesting question. Thank you so much. Because I have studied the harmonized pericopes for the Holy Week, and at the same time, the miniatures that depict the scenes from the Passion narrative. It's very likely that the Syriac traditions were deeply influenced by this attempt to summarize the four Gospels in one harmonized version, which is called Diathesaron, which was attested until the 6th century, then disappeared. And I only found some interesting details in two images. The first one is the Nativity, which does not belong to the Passion Week, but which gathers the birth of Jesus with the adoration of the Magi and the adoration of the shepherd, and also the bath of the child. So four different scenes gathered in one miniature that reflect the content of the readings. My concern is that the issue is that actually it's not a typical Syriac feature, because we can find the same images in the Greek Byzantine tradition, and the same occurs with the entry into Jerusalem, which is the other one, because we can find some elements borrowed from different Gospels. For example, Jesus entering the city with children picking branches on the trees, and people putting their garments on the soil. So I think it's not very typical of the Syriac tradition, but it says something about the common iconographic language shared by the different Christian communities throughout the Near East, because as the lectionary was invented during the same period in the Armenian, Byzantine, Syriac tradition, it's quite normal that they also share this relation to the gospel, to the text, which could manifest itself when depicting this particular images.
I would like to thank you both for this wonderful discussion. and especially Dr. Pashamiran for the illuminating paper that he gave today. And I would also like to invite you all to join us next month on December 12th for a lecture entitled Ethiopian Artists, Byzantine Teachers, and Italian Colonizers, a reflection on the early historiography of medieval Ethiopian art. The speaker will be Jacob Ogniski from University College London. Until then, be well and be safe. Thank you all.